Still have time for a Q&A. Please use a chat freely. On the second stage, second part, we're going to have a round table with different representatives of the seafood production in Portugal, Fishermen Association, the Association of Aquaculture, and the industry, the codfish industry, and the industry of seafood. So they're going to tell us about their views regarding the current challenges that the industry is about to face in the future, very much focus on sustainability. What is their view regarding sustainability in the future? As I told you at the beginning, this this program is within the Neptunus project. I would ask you to show the video of this project. The main goal is to promote sustainable development of seafood based on two fundamental strategies. The first is through green economy, promoting eco-labeling, including Nexus approach, integrating the footprint of water, energy, and the nutrients associated to the product which is consumed. And the second strategy, which is circular economy, waste management, and the consumer education. I would like you to show the video for us to have a wide-ranging idea of what is the Neptunus project. It started in 2019 in June. It was hugely affected by the pandemic, but it is finally obtaining some results on this current moment.
estamos agora a 1 minuto. 1 minuto, não? Segundos. 20. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Bom, após terem visto o vídeo
After having watched the video of the project, it had no sound, but I guess it really shows what the project is about. So I'd like to start right away the presentations. I'm going to start by inviting our researcher from IPMENT, Sheila Almeida. She's a researcher in the area of seafood sustainability on the viewpoint of the value chain from production to consumption. She's a marine biologist. She graduated from Lisbon University, and she's very experienced in communications and management of science. She's participated in several projects related with seafood, marine biodiversity, and sustainable consumption of seafood in Portugal. She's going to tell us about a topic which is really important, which is the contribution of seafood production for climate change. Sheila, you have the floor. Morning. Thank you very much, Antonio, for your kind words of introduction. I'm going to tell you about the contribution of seafood production to climate change. And I'm going to give you the theory about the topic, what we know so far, including some studies which are currently being done within the Neptunus project, just to give an idea of what we know about this topic. And then Jara and Maite, we're going to speak more specifically on the details of some sections of what I'm going to show you here. Let me start off by saying, telling you about the input of the food for climate change. We have the main greenhouse effect gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen. So you see on the black square, the 30% impact from food on greenhouse gases. So you can see the different sectors and the origin. We have the land use, agriculture, and waste. Just to give you an idea with a little bit more concrete in terms of the individual consumption patterns, on this graph, we can see what is the impact of the individual carbon footprint, what are the habits which are more or less prone to have a strong impact. So we have a vegetarian diet has a much more greater impact, like recycling or having low upgrade light bulbs like LED bulbs. So the food and transportation is essential in terms of our individual consumption habits. So what we know about food in this particular case, in this graph we're going to go into further detail, and you can see that the livestock and fish farms, aquaculture, represent around 31%. This is a really interesting part in this project. We talk about packaging quite often, but all the value chain corresponds to about 18% in packaging. You see this blue bar only corresponds to 5%. So all that concerns plastics, packages is very important. But if we think as a whole within the food sector, the production is the one which has the biggest impact in terms of the greenhouse effect, greenhouse gases. So what we know about the seafood? Seafood is called more and more blue food. The seafood, in average, will always have an average of greenhouse gases or a carbon footprint which is lower than livestock. This is one of the first comparisons to be made. The authors have made an estimate with the existing studies, and they separate in 4 different sections. So in the first blue bar, they separate aquaculture with recirculating systems and non-recirculating aquaculture. This is something which is currently being studied and discussed, and will not have the same contribution because the recirculating aquaculture has a great energy cost to maintain the closed circuit. And the few studies we had at the time pointed out to a high cost in relation to the energy utilized. But now we have new studies, and apparently this is not the same in all cases and in all species. Just to give an idea, we have 2 bars concerning aquaculture. And then we have, in terms of fisheries, we have trawling fishery and non-trawling fisheries. That's a big difference. As I will show you later on, the fishing makes all the difference in terms of the carbon footprint because they have a completely different modus operating, and the trawling fishing, because of its operations, it has to work against, operates against attrition, so it will have a worse performance in that regard. Let us go into further detail. On this graph, we have aquaculture products and the fishing products. This is a Norwegian study. On the side of the fisheries, we have 2 colors. The first, which is dark, the biggest one is the fuel, which has the biggest carbon footprint. In aquaculture, we have feed production. And within the fishing sections, I'd like to call attention to the fact that different species have different carbon footprint. A comparison between sardine, which has a very low carbon footprint. This is true that it doesn't cover high distances, and it is very efficient, always tons. And when we divide costs to catch a kilogram of fish, a functional unit, there is great efficiency. And in the codfish, the contribution for the carbon footprint is higher, and even the processing of cod, which includes other components of greenhouse gases. To give another very interesting idea, which has been widely discussed in these studies, which is the life cycle assessment. Not always the small fishing vessels under 12 meters, not always, because it's a small fishing vessel, it's associated to a low carbon footprint, and it's also the case regarding other environmental impacts. So what happens in this study? This is a study for different Danish products under the blue square, only the codfish from Denmark. You see that the fishing vessels, which are smaller, not all have the similar performance in terms of carbon footprint or better than the bigger fishing vessels. And clearly there is a huge difference in terms of the fishing techniques. We have the trawling, we have the gill nets, and we have different areas, different stocks. We have the Kattegat zone and the Baltic, Western Baltic. So we have a different cod fish catches. And now, bearing in mind the complexity of cod, it's really interesting because it's very difficult to say what is cod if we do not know what is the country of origin, what is the fishing technique of the stock. This is just to give an idea of the quantity of the fishing techniques which are associated with these cod. So it will have a different carbon footprint which is associated with the different fishing gear. Now let's move into aquaculture. This study is very interesting, which is done on oysters and mussels. And the authors are comparing the quantity of carbon dioxide per protein, and they clearly showed that the contribution of oysters and mussels is at the level of tofu, which is a vegetable protein, which is within the studies and the estimates that they found, is at the same level of the broiler, which is the more efficient livestock production. Now, this graph shows us the carbon footprint for different species. Many interesting things. For instance, in gray, we have the wild caught seafood. In purple, we have the farmed seafood. Something which is really interesting is that the gray bars have a higher length. It means that there's a higher variability. And talking about a species which is salmon, which is very highly consumed in aquaculture in Portugal, we realize that the average in terms of the carbon footprint of the farmed salmon is lower than the wild salmon. But we also realize, on the other hand, because there's such a high variability in the wild salmon, this may be related with the fact that the wild salmon comes from different countries caught with different fishing gear. For instance, the lower level of this estimate is lower than the average of the farmed salmon. So there's a huge variation. The more studies we have, the more we come to understand about this change. Something also really relevant I'd like to call to attention to in relation to bivalves. There's a huge difference in the contribution of the greenhouse gases into bivalves compared with the wild bivalves and the farm bivalves. Because the bivalves from aquaculture are an animal protein with huge potential. There is no, it does not include the cost of feed. It's very interesting to further exploit and to incentivize more systems related with the species. Just to give an idea of what aquaculture is, in this article, the authors have revised global aquaculture. They realized the huge growth in the last 20 years, but what I'd really like to call your attention in those species with the highest quantity produced in the world are algae or seaweed, and we have the carp, which is more produced. It's not very common in Portugal, though. So there's a huge diversity of groups and systems. When we talk about aquaculture, for instance, when we talk about the farm salmon, which only represents 2% of the global aquaculture, is to be restricted to something which is very much limited because it's very much consumed in Portugal. But aquaculture has a wide variety of organisms, most of them in terms of quantity has to do with quantities of organisms from freshwater, and bivalves represent a big share of this production. Let me call your attention to the following. We talked about carbon footprint, and clearly this is our main goal, but we always, when talking about fishing and aquaculture, we have to mention other impacts. Because the carbon footprint cannot only be analyzed within a box. it sounds obvious for those working in biology and conservation, but not as obvious for those working in these studies of the life cycle analysis. So I'd like to mention other impacts which are very important. Now, in relation to fishing, we have to talk about the stocks, which are extremely difficult. For instance, the stock management, for instance, in yellow, dark yellow, in yellow or in orange, we have tuna, which are in the Atlantic Ocean, and you can see the wide amount of countries participating in this management body and the difficulty in deciding fishing quotas and to carry out long-term management. And despite this very complex situation, we have even another issue within Europe, within the common agricultural, common fisheries policy that Portugal has to comply with. The maximum sustainable income of the fishing stocks. In this graph, as you can see, there is a high quantity of stocks which are managed by the common fisheries policy, which are above the maximum sustainable yield. So they give us many concerns within Europe. So if something can be done, we should start working on the fishing stocks that European countries are currently managing. So which is really important when you're talking about fishing, there are always rejections. So the fishing has the goal of catching the target species, but then we can have some bycatches by species, but there's always some discards, and these discards also have to be assessed and somehow be included in these studies. That can you imagine in the life cycle assessment, this is not quantified for the time being. There are some people working upon this, and I hope that in future this can be accounted for. So this is a category which is associated to a seafood product. In relation to the food web, this researcher, Daniel Pauly, in the 90s, he initiated this concept, which is fishing down the food web. We are taking predators from the top of the trophic chain, and we are affecting lower trophic levels with consequences that we do not yet know. Just to give you an idea of what the predators are, this shows the parallel between the predators in the inland and the maritime system. And when we're talking about tuna, there were a series of events related to other species to get to the top of the trophic chain. So it's very different to capture predators, because there's it affects the trophic chain, and the lower in the trophic chain the organisms are being taken away, the more efficient system is. Something that we really have to assess are the impacts on the sea bottom, the octopus. We are studying the bottom trawling in the Algarve. As you can see in the pictures, this is a trap. The octopus goes inside, and you also have the octopus caught with the bottom trawling. In relation to agriculture, we have to talk about feed, and there's been great evolution in terms of feed. As we have the a few quantity of fish in feed, but the part of fish which was feed which was replaced is much more efficient, because we're not using wild fish, but it has more consequences at terrestrial level. So it's very important that these two systems, the land and the sea, in agriculture have to be jointly assessed, because if we are using cereals and other sources coming from land production, we're going to have the land use, which is a very important impact category because the arable land is becoming more limited and have any problems related to biodiversity.
This graph, to give you an idea, shows precisely that proportion of vegetables, cereals, and for example, Norwegian salmon throughout time. We see there was a great decrease. But then we have other impacts that have to do with the use of cereals and other land-based components. We can think of different improvements, and we can use insects as an alternative source of nutrition, or within possible, also use byproducts from seafood processing. I would like to end by highlighting the main ideas, the main conclusions. When it comes to production, it's the most important component of food when it comes to the carbon footprint. Seafood is indeed the best source of animal protein when it comes to environmental performance, but it does have a carbon footprint, and we have to think of fisheries and aquaculture has two different things, and there is great variability depending on the fishing gear. And the carbon footprint is just one of the indicators. We have to think about other environmental impacts that cannot be overlooked when it comes to seafood. And so I conclude my presentation. I don't know if there may be some time for questions still. Antonio? Thank you, Shaila. Fortunately, we reached the end of this time slot, but I would just like to say that Shaila's presentation shows that there is some variability, but we can use these data as marketing for some seafood products. Of course, we can improve, and we should improve, but it's also important to use the data as marketing, because when we compare to other sources of animal protein, seafood presents a lot of advantages. Whether it results from fisheries or from aquaculture, of course, that in fisheries it depends on the fishing gear. But it's important for consumers to know this. For now, we don't have time for questions, but nevertheless, it's 9:30 here in Portugal, 10:30 in Spain, and I would like people, nevertheless, to participate and share questions on the chat. Now, I'm going to present Lara.
She is a chemical engineering specialist in life cycle assessment and circular economy. She has done a lot of work since her PhD. She works in the biomolecular and chemical engineering department at the University of Cantabria in Spain. And she has particularly focused her research on life cycle assessment, circular economy, sustainability, eco-labeling, and carbon footprint in food in general, and particularly in seafood. Jara is going to present the concept of the methodology of life cycle assessment, which is important for all of us to be aware, focus particularly on life cycle assessment methodology application, environmental footprints, and environmental products declaration. Jara, the floor is yours. It's a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for your kind presentation. Well, as Antonio said, I am postdoctoral research at the University of Cantabria. I work in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering in the DEPRO group, and our research lines are focused on life cycle assessment of products and processes, circular economy, eco-designs, and water, energy, and food nexus. And also, in this case, we are the lead partner of the Neptune project. I'm going to talk about the concept of life cycle assessment. Sheila give you some data about the carbon footprint of seafood products. So I'm going to explain how these values are calculated, the methodology that we follow, and then how this value are communicate to consumers or the public in general by means of ecolabels. Well, the definition of the life cycle assessment is this. The life cycle assessment is a powerful methodology to assess the inputs, outputs, and potential environmental impacts of a product, process, or service from the whole life cycle. In this picture, you can see the life cycle of a seafood product. The life cycle starts with the raw material extraction, then the transport of these raw materials. These raw materials enters to the production or transforming step and packaging, then the distribution of these products, the use, and finally the end of life of these products, the waste treatment of the different residues. When we perform a life cycle assessment, we have to define the system boundaries that we want to assess, and depending on the steps that we want to analyze, we can use different approaches. For example, a cradle-to-gate approach, which considers the first steps of the life cycle of the product, the raw material extraction, the transport, and the product and packaging step. So this approach finish when the products are ready to be distributed. Then, if we consider a gate-to-gate approach, we only assess the production and packaging step, only the different process units in the company, for example. Then, if we use a gate-to-grave approach, we are assessing the last steps of the life cycle of the products, the distribution, use, and end of life. And finally, the most complete approach is the cradle-to-gate approach, which includes all the life cycle steps of the product. To perform the life cycle assessment, we follow the ISO standards 14040 and 14044, and the life cycle assessment are divided into 4 steps. The first one is the definition of the goal and scope. The second one is the life cycle inventory. The third is the life cycle impact assessment. And finally, the last step is the interpretation of the results obtained. To see more in detail each step, I'm going to start with the definition of the goal and scope. The goal of a life cycle assessment study has to define what is the intended application of our study, why we are carrying out the study, for whom, that is the audience who is going to use these results, and whether the results are intended to be used in comparative assertion intended to be disclosed to the public. So it's very important, firstly, define these 4 questions to start with the life cycle assessment. Then the scope have to include all these items. The first one is the definition of the product system. Then it's very important to define the function of the product systems. For example, in our case, in the case of the Neptunus project, we have to define the function of our analysis. In this case, for example, could be to produce fish cans, to produce or to capture a certain amount of fish, or to produce different types of seafood products. Then another important thing is the definition of the functional unit. The functional unit is the element that quantifies the function of the systems, the calculation basis for which all inputs and outputs of the system must refer. In our case, we have different functional units depending on the product system that we are analyzing. For example, if we are analyzing a fishery system, the functional unit could be 1 kilogram of landed fish. But on the other hand, if we are analyzing transformation of fish or canning process, for example, the functional unit could be a can of fish or a final product of seafood, of transformed seafood. Then, as I said before, it's important to define the system boundaries. It's important to define the different steps that we want to analyze. If we want to analyze the whole life cycle, or we only want to analyze a cradle-to-grave approach or a gate-to-gate approach. Another important thing is the allocation procedures. In our case, most of our processes are multi-output processes. That is to say, there are a lot of products. For example, when fishing fleets land by catch or target multiple species. So in this case, if we want to allocate the environmental impacts to one species, we have to apply different allocations based on mass, economic, or energy criteria. And then other important items of the scope is the definition of the impact categories, or the different assumptions and limitations that we have to define, or that we have to take to perform the analysis. The second step is the life cycle inventory. This phase involves the compilation and quantification of inputs and outputs for a product. These steps maybe is the most time-consuming step, because we have to collect a lot of data. We have to take in contact with stakeholders, producers, fishermen, to collect high quality data. The data that we need are related with energy consumption, raw materials consumption, the transport of these materials, the different products that are obtained, and also the outputs of the processes, such as emissions, effluents, and wasted. So this is a hard step, and the results of the analysis, of the life cycle analysis, depends on the quality of this data. Here you can see an example of a data sheet for a unit process. You can see that we usually collect the data referring a year in particular, and then well, you can see the material inputs, different consumption, energy consumption, water consumption, and also the outputs, such as products or effluents, residues, and emissions. And in the right, you can see the questionnaire that we use in Neptunus to collect our data. In this case, is the data for the fishing systems. So you can see that we ask a lot of data, general data about the fishing zone, the fishing year, also data about the vessels, the different species captured, the different raw material consumptions, diesel, ice, a lot of data. And then when we have collected all the data, we have to transform these inputs and outputs into environmental impacts. So in these steps, we use different environmental methods, in which these methods define different emission factors, which transform the different substances and components into environmental impacts. For example, for the case of the carbon footprint, we can use the EPPC methods to transform the different emissions, CO2, methane, nitrogen oxides, into CO2 equivalent, which is the unit of the carbon footprint. Well, once we have the life cycle assessment and we have the results of the life cycle assessment, it is important to communicate the results to the consumers or the customers, and we use the ecolabels to do it. So what is the objective of ecolabels? The objective is to foster demand and supply of environmental friendly products and services. How? Well, stimulating the continuous market driving environmental improvement and by means of communication of viable, accurate, and not misleading information about the environmental aspects of products and service. So an ecolabel is a way to communicate an environmental results to consumers, and an easy way. And of course, the ecolabels try to avoid confusion and greenwashing, because in the market you can see a lot of ecolabels that in most of cases they are not based on life cycle assessment, and a lot of companies use this marketing strategy called greenwashing, that it consists in to make people believe that a company is doing more to protect the environment than it really is. And it creates the illusion of ecological responsibility. So the ecolabels try to avoid this type of confusing information. In the last years, have been a growing interest of companies for showing the environmental aspects of their products by means of the ecolabels, as you can see in this graph. There are 3 types of ecolabels. In this graph, I think this graph not include self-declaration, so this graph only include ecolabels type 1 that we are going to see now, and ecolabels type 3, which are the environmental product declarations. Well, as I said, there are 3 types of ecolabels according to the ISO classification. The type 1 ecolabels are voluntary and multiple criteria based label, and they are certified by a third party, by an external reviewer. And they indicate usually the overall environmental preferability of a product within a particular product category. So usually they show a decrease in the environmental impact of a product. They usually are a picture, and when indicates that they are meeting some requirements, environmental requirements. The second type of ecolabels, type 2, are self-declared environmental labels. So this type of labels do not need independent third-party certification, and usually are developed by the company. And the last one, the type 3, are the environmental product declarations. This type of ecolabels provide quantified environmental data, and these ecolabels use the life cycle assessment methodology to calculate the environmental impacts. You can see in this table the different characteristics of the ecolabels. As you can see, only type 3 ecolabel use the life cycle assessment, and type 1 and type 3 needs a third-party verification. The different ecolabels communicate in a different way. For example, the EPDs, the environmental product declarations, give a quantitative profile of the product. And well, as you can see, the type 3 are preferable to business communication and green procurement, but they could be difficult for the consumer to understand all the information that are included in them. Well, here you can see some examples of type 1 ecolabels. They are voluntary. They are awarded by independent third part, and they say that they are environmentally preferable products than other type of product, similar products, but they say that they are better than other products in terms of, for example, carbon footprint or water use, or resources use, for example. Here you have different examples of the type 2 ecolabels, the self-declarations. Usually they don't need a third-party verifier, but they follow ISO standards. And they usually appear in the packaging of the products or in the different labels with with different type of advertising, of publicity, and also in the digital media. And finally, these are the type 3 ecolabels, the environmental product declarations. I think they are the most complete and the most useful for the companies, because they are a report. They are not a picture. They are a report with qualitative and quantitative environmental information about the product. These information are based on a life cycle assessment study. This study has been carried out following a predefined calculation rules, which are the product category rules. Its product are included in a product category rules, and they are independently verified. Here you can see the different benefits of the EPDs. They respond to the demands of the customers. The customers want to know the environmental impact of the products. So this type of ecolabels give you the information that you need. Also, they could improve the company image and its transparency towards the market, because you are showing your the environmental impact of your product. They can be audited and validated by independent body. So this also improves the transparency of the product. Under the marketing point of view, this type of declaration improve the competitiveness of the company at an international level, and also allows to introduce the product in green markets. And as each product have to be included in a product category rule, which is a document which collect of the steps that you have to follow to perform the life cycle assessment of this type of product. These ecolabels also allows the comparison between similar products. To obtain a environmental product declaration, it's necessary to follow different steps. The first one is the product category rule selections. So it's necessary to find the most adequate PCR. Here you can see an example of a PCR for the case of fish and fish products. The PCR is a document that contains like a recipe to create a high quality EPD. These documents provide the instruction for how the life cycle assessment should be conducted. So it includes the system boundaries, the functional unit that you have to use, the different impact categories that you have to calculate. So the first step is the definition of the product category rules according to our product. Then we have to collect the data, including raw material, resource consumption, and waste data for our product, always following the product category rules of this product. Then we have to prepare the EPD report. In this EPD, we have to perform the life cycle assessment report with details about the life cycle assessment methodology, the different assumptions that we have to do, and the approach that we have to employ. And then the third party verifications revise the document. And when the EPD is agree with when the EPD program or the verifier is agree with all the information that are in the EPD report, this report is published, and you can use this report for your marketing purpose. You can put them in your website. You can give the report to your customers or what you want. And to finish, I would like to show you an example of EPD. In this case, it's an EPD for fish and fish products. I think it's the first EPD that have been made with these product category rules. Let's see. You can see the document? No, maybe I have to compare the, maybe I have to share. And now you can see the document, Antonio, yes?
Yeah, yes, Shara,
Yes,
yes.
okay.
Please go ahead and fast because we are delayed already.
Yes, yes, I finished with this. This is an example of an environmental product declaration for a seafood product. As you can see, there are information about the EPD program, about the product category rules that they are followed, information about the company, and information about the process of the company. And here the different products that they are assessed. And here starts with the methodology, the system boundaries, the life cycle assessment software that they use. In this case, Umberto Life Cycle Assessment, the database that they use, EcoInvent, the different cutoff rules, assumptions, and the impact evaluation methodology, the allocation rules, the system boundaries. So you can see it's a very completed report with a lot of information, and at the end you can see the different value for the different environmental impacts, global warming potential, acidification, eutrophication, and so on. So yes, here are different results for the different products that they are assessing. Okay, well, this is all the information that I want to share with you. If you have any questions, I answer you, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Shara. It was very interesting. I'm sure that for the industry, it seems a complex methodology, but at the end, the results that are provided enable to improve the processes that they have at the industry and also to market their products, and this is important.
Yes.
So let's move on. We don't have time for questions.
Okay.
I'm just going to ask to the audience, don't forget to include questions in the chat, please. And now
Yes.
I have the great honor and pleasure to introduce our researcher, from University of Santiago de Compostela. Maria Teresa Moreira, for us it's Maite. She is a professor of chemical engineering. She is specialist in treatment of residual waters and in the application of life cycle assessment methodology. She has a very impressive publication record, and all the work that she has accomplished so far enables us to have the honor to hear from her. She has received also an award from the Royal Galician Academy of Sciences in 2019, before the pandemic, and she is also scientific director of the research center Cretus at Santiago de Compostela University. Maite is going to show us about an example of mitigation strategy to mitigate carbon footprint by providing presentation about the experiences of eco-certification of seafood products in fisheries in northwestern Spain. Maite, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Shall I share my screen? Yes? Okay.
Yes, please, Maite.
Hopefully you can see that. It's okay?
Not yet.
Sorry. Now?
Yes, now perfect.
You can see my screen, right?
Okay. Yes, Maite.
Because I can see myself in the screen, so I'm not so sure. So my presentation here follows a little bit the introduction that Hara has already talked about the application of eco-certification in seafood products. I would like to mention here that I belong to a research center in environmental technologies in University of Santiago de Compostela, but I would also would like to recall the people involved here in the group. Sorry, this picture is not so actual. A lot of people is missing here, but it's because of the pandemic that we have not the final picture. On the top, on the right, you can see the people involved in directly with us, working on wastewater treatment and also life cycle assessment in our group, which is quite large. And you can see here on the bottom, the people involved in the Cretus initiative. So, and the idea is to group and to integrate research on different topics of environmental technologies, not only for a chemical engineering point of view or environmental engineering, but also people working on microbiology, ecotoxicology, social and economic aspects, modelization, etc. So, and this is a research group that has like 10 scientists that are among the 2% of the most cited in the world according to the Stanford ranking. So this is people that wants to work together and wants to create a good research. And talking about eco-labels, so why and for what purpose? So what is the idea? We have to think that when we are evaluating a product, in this case, seafood, we want to demonstrate that the product has a quality, has a warranty of origin, but also provides information to consumers and it can be useful for a marketing strategy. So it's good for the consumers and it's good for the producers. If we check here in this web page, the number of eco-labels are tremendous, are very large. So you can see that they are widely implemented in countries and different industry sectors. For example, the ones that we can recognize the most are, for example, the energy. When we are buying household appliance for the house, we typically check what is the category of energy consumption that it has. Or, for example, the one related to certification of carbon footprint, such as the carbon label. The one that it is really well known for many sectors is the European Ecolabel that follows a life cycle assessment approach for the quantification. But please note that it is useful to assess products, but not including medicines, food, and beverage. So when we are identifying what are the environmental criteria that are more relevant for the consumers, for the general public, is carbon dioxide emissions, for sure. We are all concerned about the possibility of climate change and how this value, how this indicator is changing and evolving and increasing over time, and all the protocols, the meetings, the actions made to mitigate this climate change. And we have to be aware that what are the sectors that are the most influential for this indicator: energy, transport, but also food production and consumption. In this case, for example, when we are evaluating what are the initiatives for eco-labels for food products, we can identify a number of them. Just an example here, I'm introducing the Carbon Trust initiative, and you can see that is well implemented in United Kingdom, for example, and in other countries. For example, for the French markets, the Bilan Carbone. And when they label all the products in the market, they will have a final compilation of the carbon footprint related to our purchase in the market. And I have introduced here and included Pesca en Verde, which is specific, and this is our experience for the fish sector. As Haras has mentioned, to determine the carbon footprint of a food product, in this case is horse mackerel, we have to evaluate extensively what are the performance of the fishing activities, typically related to a certain number that may be 1 kilogram of fish. And in this case, I'm not showing, repeating again what are all the process and the stages to be accomplished, but this requires an extensive compilation of results that comes for the different sectors in the fish supply chain. For example, in this case, this level of carbon footprint is really rather low in comparison, for example, with beef meat. But we have also to take into account that depending on the activities, on the fishing gears, on the transport, the logistic, these numbers may change. For example, here you can see that the fuel consumption is the one that accounts for the highest share in the environmental impacts in carbon footprint. And perhaps we are also interested in including water footprint, which is quite relevant. The consumption of water for us nowadays is quite relevant, especially in Spain and in Portugal, that are suffering more episodes of water scarcity in certain regions. So the direct consumption, but also the indirect consumption, has to be communicated. Also, energy consumption it's important, and you can see that it's related with the climate change, among other impact categories. But the truth is that it is important to identify specifically the energy consumption among the other indicators for the product that we are evaluating. We are also interested in determining what is the nutritional footprint, and maybe different for the different types of food that we are evaluating. For example, in the case of fish, we have selected these. Some of them were included in the conventional list for the nutritional indicators, while others were discarded. For example, here it's very important to determine the content of protein. It's very relevant, or omega-3 fatty acids, and the presence of certain minerals. But it is not important, and we cannot include, for example, other indicators such as fiber, for example, or sugar, something like that. And in this case, we have considered that the nutrients to be limited should be saturated fats or excessive concentration of salt in terms of sodium. So when we have this information, it is interesting to integrate them. So not only to have the criteria of carbon footprint, that is something that you have seen that has been addressed in many and different eco labels around the world, but how to integrate more information available for consumers. That is the idea of Neptunos. Providing more information, useful information regarding seafood. And in this case, we have selected these 4 footprints: carbon, water, energy, and nutritional footprints, performing a life cycle assessment for the different species. We calculate the impacts, we have to normalize them. So when we have different numbers and we have different units of measure, we have to make them equivalent. And the way to do so is by normalization. And then we have to wait between different indicators. So we have to indicate what is more important: carbon footprint, water footprint, how we evaluate that. And this is the final stage of the assessment. The idea is to get to a final eco-label, including all this information. And I have to say that in this case, this eco-label is the one with the widest approach and the one that is more multidisciplinary, because it not only considers those environmental indicators, but also nutritional indicators. So the idea is to include this eco-label in the different seafood products to be marketed. And as I said, we have experience with the implementation of eco-labels for seafood. And in this case, it was an initiative that was taken several years ago and has been recently implemented in Galician markets. The idea is to include not only the carbon footprint, but also information about the energy in an indirect way. So please know that in this case, a ROI indicator consider what is the content of protein as the major indicative of the nutritional value of the fish, and then how much energy do you need to produce this amount of protein. So in terms of protein, we are identifying the energy required for this protein supply. And here, this is a snapshot of the web page when we have the Pesca en Verde and the information. Sorry, it's in Spanish, but you can see that the names are in Galician. So perhaps you can identify quite different types of different products, seafood and also fish, and the different ways that they are captured, the catch of these species. And also we have a certain reference values for these species. In 2018, we have quite large group of fish market certified, and the fish landed in these markets were important. You can see that includes all the Galician coast, and it has been implemented more in this last period in 2021, including more groups. And more recently, we have included also Burela because it's very relevant for merluza hake. So the inclusion of these, it has this, you can see, I don't know if you can see the pictures and the photographs, but this information is very, very recent. This last month has been included, this last fish market in Burela. And the publicity and the impact that it has in social media, in newspapers, in televisions were amazing. So the thing is that, and all the people that at the beginning, when we were presenting the possibility of including this type of fish in Pesca en Verde, at the beginning they were quite reluctant, but at the end, when we have this beneficial report on their this type of fish, they were very glad and they were eager to include more. So perhaps at the beginning, I would like to encourage people that are not so involved in this type of certification, just to try what are the benefits regarding this, because there are so many. And it also positions your product in the market. For example, I think that 2 days ago, we have a meeting with people working on mussel trade. So, and they were evaluating, they were economists working, some of them in Kritos. But the thing is that they were evaluating the trade for mussel. And the thing is that I was so surprised is that one of the main markets for mussels is Rotterdam, so the Netherlands, right, and Belgium. And the truth is that most of their mussels come from New Zealand. So why not exporting Galician mussels to these markets? Not only proving that it is a good product, but it has an indicative and a label that indicates that the product is not that good. It's very good, but it's also environmental friendly. And one thing that I would like to mention at the end, I'm sorry if I'm quite late, is the diet. Because when we are evaluating what is the impact of a certain product, we are missing sometimes what is the impact on the diet. And now that we are talking in this context, Galicia and Portugal, the diet that applies for us is the Atlantic diet. And we have evaluated the Atlantic very low carbon footprint. For example, 3 times lower than in the case of America. It is true that if we are comparing with India, it is higher here than in India, but the thing is that they are not, the quality, the nutritional quality of the diet is not so good, and it's mainly vegetarian, and it's very restricted to certain food items. And for example, we have are presented here the results more focused on the seafood sector, but we have applied this methodology of life cycle assessment to many different sectors, to different types of facilities. So for more information, please contact me any moment. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Maite. This is a very good example on how research can help the industry, and the other way around with this interaction is fruitful for the industry and to promote the different types of seafood industry that we have, not only in Portugal, but in Europe. Just before I know that we are delayed, but I would not like to finish this session and go for the roundtable without asking some one or two questions. And since the audience is being shy, I will put me and Sheila. We have prepared one question for you, Maite, and for Chara. I will start myself because it's for Maite. It's in the continuation of your presentation. When you gave the example of the fishing boat, where the fishing boat had that specific label of low environmental impact, and initially they were reluctant, but then at the end they start seeing the benefits. Did you have time to assess these benefits? Which were the benefits for the fishing boat? Were they able to sell at a higher price the merluza in this case, or which were other benefits? Can you guide us?
Yeah, it is quite early to determine these benefits for the sector. But I especially, for example, in the case of merluza, because it has been implemented this month, so at the beginning of the month. But for example, in the case of the fish that is captured around the coast, this type of labeling has been implemented in the pesca de bajura, in the fishing that is around the coast, yeah, and they get the benefit that they have an extensive evaluation of their activities, but also they count with the support of the Galician government. So the Galician government is the one that support these activities because they are very interested in promoting the image of the fish that the Galicia can supply to the world. And for example, I can remember one time that happened that, for example, there was a fishing trawl that it was planned to be forbidden and in the European Union, and they asked us to evaluate what could be the environmental impacts. If you compare this with another one that is more or less similar, no? It's different in the fishing gear, but it's similar. They ask us this information as additional criteria for that. So if they are blaming on the environmental impacts, let's prove if we are to be blamed. So this is something that is like a support, an additional support. And for example, in the case of ecolabel, it's not also implemented in the case of food in Spain, but for example, I can remember of many years when you are buying something in United Kingdom and it has the carbon trust. All the supermarkets, all the chips, everything, potato chips in the supermarket, they are labeled with the carbon trust. And it is a way to be introduced in the market. It's a way to support their image and communicate better. For example, I have another experience in this case in the French markets. Once that we were invited by the French environmental agency in Paris. They were invited us to participate in a study to report our experience regarding the tuna. In that case, it was tuna and chicken. And they were indicated, for example, the case that they used in supermarket in France when they compare the tomato origin and how they report not only the price of the product, but also, okay, this tomato comes from France, this tomato comes from Spain or from Morocco, something like that. And the carbon footprint score that they indicated along with the price. So including with the price, they have this information. And this is something that you have to be there to communicate, okay, I have this certification. You cannot blame me for a higher carbon footprint if it's not true. So I think this is something that support producers.
It supports also transparency.
International markets.
Yeah, and transparency to consumers and to the market.
For sure,
definitely.
Because otherwise, perhaps they are given the score that they think they have. But the consumers with a valid certification should be the ones, okay, this is the activities that I perform and I have to report them.
Okay. Well, Maite, thank you very much. I'm going now to put a question to Jara. It comes from Sheila from the chat. And the first question from Sheila is how many EPDs exist for seafood products, both from fisheries and aquaculture? Do you know, and which one?
Well, I was looking for in the web. If you want, I have the website of Environdec open, so I can show you the web. Yes, you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, this is the website of the International EPD System. You can register in the EPD portal. It's public, it's free, and you can do a search. You have the EPD library and the PCR library. So this is the PCR library, and if you look for by product category, if you select food and beverage, you have all of these product category rules, and this is the product category rules that I show you in my presentation. And inside this product category rule, I only found this EPD, EPD, which is the fish and fish product from AquaChile, which is what I show you in my presentation. I think that these product category rules for fish and fresh fish product or something like that is very recent. So I suppose that in the next months, years, it could be more EPDs.
Okay. So products. Something to follow in the coming months, definitely.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to ask. There is another question. This is for Sheila. I will give the floor for Sheila here. Adolfo Franco asks in the chat, which is the importance, the relative importance of preservation period from frozen products in carbon footprint? Sheila, do you have any clue about that?
Se calhar eu posso responder agora em português, não é?
I believe I can answer in Portuguese. I haven't worked in a case study that worked with the frozen portion of the processing, but it's very different from country to country. For example, Portugal has a large percentage of electricity coming from renewable energies, and so that affects the footprint. But it is indeed very important because we're talking about the freezing and refrigeration gases. But it depends on the type of product, the amount of product. It would be interesting to assess that. We don't have a case study in Neptunus when it comes to freezing, but there is some fishing boats that have that component, and in those boats, the carbon footprint is higher because of that freezing component, if the boats have that type of equipment, that type of gear.
Se calhar, António, se calhar passávamos agora à mesa.
Maybe now we could move right away to the round table. Just one last question asked by Francisco Leitão.
Francisco, eu vou responder em português. Tanto a Maite falou sobre este assunto em nível de primeira certificação.
So Maite talked, went about the certification in the fishing market. In the fish market, if it would be relevant. Well, since this is quite recent, they don't have the information yet, but soon probably they will have that information, how it affects those markets, those fish auction markets.
I would like to thank Jara and Maite for your excellent overview of the methodologies and of the mitigation strategies, Sheila as well. And thank you very much for your time. And now we are going to pass to the second stage of our event that Sheila will lead. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Obrigada, António. Então, vou passar já diretamente aqui.
Thank you, António. I have here a few questions. The idea is to have a conversation, a roundtable with our guests. And I start precisely by thanking them for being here. They represent a bit each part of the sector. People that can also share some insights also regarding some of the issues that were mentioned also by Francisco. So we have with us 4 participants, Sonia Lee. She is from the Fishermen's Association of Fuzeta. Then Fábio Barroso from the Portuguese Association Agriculture. So he's precisely representing the aquaculture sector. Then we have Pedro Bastos, Nutrifresco. It is an international company which sells mainly to restaurants. And Pedro has always participated in these debates regarding sustainability. And then Vitor Lucas from Lograde, a codfish company with a lot of information insight when it comes to codfish and its processing. I will start with a general question. To understand your perception in your activities when it comes to the contribution of your activities to climate change. So I wanted to know if the carbon footprint is something that is debated within the scope of your activities, in your strategy, and how you approach suppliers, customers, and if sustainability is part of the policy of your company, of your association, and how you address that. I would start with Sonia. I would ask you to be brief and answer in 5 minutes for this first round. You have the floor, Sonia. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me, Sheila. So, I am part of an association of fishermen, artisanal fishing. most it's very focused also on trap fishing. When I saw the questions, if I asked a fisherman, it's not easy. I cannot answer for all of them. If I ask a fisherman if he knows what the carbon footprint is, going to say, what? No, I don't know. I've never worried about that. I've never thought about it. If I ask it in a different way, if I ask, are you worried about how you're polluting the waste that you're producing? They will, the 20% will say yes, but 80% is still misinformed. We're talking about very artisanal fishing vessels and fishing gear. There isn't much consensus regarding that. Younger fishermen that are starting out now have that mindset and talk about that. They use a lot the word sustainability. They talk about sustainable fishing. But if we ask them what is sustainable, then it gets a bit complicated. But what has been done and what's important for them in sustainability is to have a resource. They worry a lot more about the resources. They want a resource that is profitable for them, but that is sustainable, and what that it means for them, so that will continue to exist tomorrow, that tomorrow and next week they will be able to fish and will still be able to make a profit. That's the main concern when it comes to sustainability, is profitability. We have to, of course, explain that being sustainable involves other aspects of the product. To be sustainable, we need to know what we're fishing, what we're capturing, and what we're leaving behind in the sea, because they want to bring everything to land. Some of the problems that we have seen is, especially in this type of fishing, is a lot of fishing gear made out of plastic. If we tried to look at what's left in the sea, we'll probably have a heart attack. If we look on that side, and I saw that the presentations talked about the carbon footprint in terms of what is more environmentally friendly in terms of fish products. But if we looked at what's left in the sea, that would also lead to a different calculation of the carbon footprint. Yes, we're studying that for Algarve. For them, it's important. We have talked about certification, and they understand the importance from the economic standpoint. Of course, it needs to be profitable from an economic standpoint. Even if we're trying to be environmentally friendly, well, they're not going to sell something if they sell at a loss. The type of fishing gear that they have in Algarve is quite different from compared to north to south. Here in Algarve, they usually just work with one species. It's a bit different when we have in the north region, we have a ship that can have 3 different types of fishing gear. In Algarve, they focus just one fishing gear and one species. And so they would like to see the certification of the product, and they know that it's an economic edge for them. Thank you, Sonia. I would just add that it's also quite selective. Yes, the rejection rate. Usually in the traps, you have a species as well. Then there isn't a lot of rejection because if they don't sell, they take home. Now I move on to Fábio to give us the perspective of aquaculture in Portugal. Good morning, everyone. I share what Sonia said, especially in terms of more traditional artisanal fishing. We're talking about family business. They're doing it because the parents, the grandparents already did it. They already had a fishing company, already aquaculture production. But here we also have another aspect in terms of aquaculture. We see that in terms of aquaculture and seafood in general has a lower environmental impact when compared to other types of animal protein like livestock, which when contributing to climate change, we also contributing to worse conditions for aquaculture because they won't be able to produce as much. So there is this added pressure. And of course, that producers think more and more about that. Our concern as an association is also growing, and we work with the European Federation in coordination also with the European Commission, looking at the environmental and carbon footprint of our products. We're creating guidelines to decrease the carbon footprints. It has to do with packaging and production methods. And also when it comes to certification, it's very important because aquaculture has a much more negative image when it comes to consumers than fishing. So it's important to have this certification in terms of sustainability and lower environmental impact. And we're working with the Aquaculture Stewardship Council to be able to have that certification at European level, not just at the level of Portugal. And this is very important. Besides that, the impacts are much higher when it comes to fish. In terms of bivalves, it's much more sustainable. And so that is an added value in terms of that type of production. In terms of consumers and their concerns with environmental impact, we already have some studies when it comes to those labels and the use of those labels and comparing the demand when it comes to labeled or non-labeled products. And we see that consumers are getting more and more environmentally aware, and they don't mind paying a bit extra if it's more environmentally friendly. Thank you, Fábio. Now I'll give the floor to Pedro to know how your company deals with this. You have proximity with clients. Yes, NutriFresco focuses on top gastronomy, excellence gastronomy, and we deal mostly with passionate chefs, passionate about excellent seafood. There is a positive side. This they want great fish, and usually that comes through artisanal fishing. So this completely suits top gastronomy. Fortunately, that artisanal fishing is more sustainable in terms of habitat, it's less destructive, and it also in terms of energy consumption. So we, by favoring artisanal fishing, we are already favoring a less environmental impact. In terms of trawling, we are not fundamentalists because we know that fishing is still more sustainable and we can't survive just with other type of fishing. So we need trawlers, especially for shrimp, for crustaceans. So we're not fundamentalists. When it's possible to have artisanal fishing, line fishing, we're passionate about that, yes. And our main customers are restaurants, renowned chefs, they're opinion makers, trend makers, and they can influence society. But I think that nowadays we can do also more in terms of providing information in restaurants in terms of the products that are available. If sometimes in the menu they mention how it was captured, the fishing gear, and even the supplier. In our work, we try to foster artisanal fishing, which is quite diversified, and diversified consumption of different species. We're bit victims of the overwhelming marketing on part of aquaculture producer when it comes to salmon and other species. They're already processed, low price. Even in five-star hotels, I can tell you that sometimes it has to do with the price and not whether it's locally sourced or not. When you go to fine dining and Michelin star restaurants, yes, they try to focus on locally sourced because it's very, very fresh. And that is very important because that's also ends up being connected to the carbon footprint. It's ultra fresh and it's more environmentally friendly. In our specific case, in the case of NutriFresco, we have distribution in Portugal with 14 vehicles, and then we also export, but we also subject to the quickest export means, which is airplane, and that has a higher carbon footprint, but it also has to do with the consumption trend. We see a higher demand for seafood, but of course people want it fresh. It has to arrive as soon as possible. And someone in India and China can have quick access to what is captured in Portugal. And we don't have a lot of solutions, but we have been contributing in terms of decreasing the number of vehicles by decreasing, for example, the weight of the vehicles and trying to find electric vehicles or gas-fueled vehicles to always try to decrease our carbon footprint. It's more about, it comes from our responsibility, our ethical and social responsibility, not so much on part of our customers. We're after fishermen and before the chef. And so how can we decrease our carbon footprint as a middleman, taking the fish from the fishermen to the restaurants, to the chefs? If we can transport the fish by consuming less fuel, that's of course good. In terms of packaging, we try not to use and try to decrease styrofoam, because it's a single use, and we want something that is more environmentally friendly. We're talking about using the cardboard packages more and more. I've said regarding our fleet in terms of exports, there isn't much we can do. And for example, some times ago, there was a chef who bought aquaculture fish from Australia. It went through post to Spain, then to Portugal, and to cook, and then sent it to a northern country in Europe. So you can see what this fish traveled. He just wanted the fish that suited his recipe the best, with a certain level of fat already processed, and that was the most convenient. But it basically traveled the entire earth. This to show you that we still have a lot to do in terms of raising awareness, in terms of restaurants, in gastronomy, when it comes to carbon footprint. There is some awareness regarding fishing gear, and when it comes to artisanal fishing, but in terms of energy consumption, overall carbon footprint, there is still a lot of work to be done. And I would just like to conclude with, when it comes to with the different types of fishing gear and distribution, we have a customer that is thinking about distributing the seafood by resorting to electric bicycles. Of course, this depends on the landscape that you have in a certain country, but there is a market niche valuing artisanal fishing, but also more environmentally friendly fishing. But there is a lot of communication work to be done, yes, and local labels are interesting and helpful in that. I think 10 years from now, we will have situations where chefs will prefer a fisherman that captures squid through line fishing and has a rowboat. But it's important to have a niche that values and influences is the first step. Thank you, Pedro. Maybe we don't need a sailboat. We can have some engines that don't have as much emissions. Electric ships will slowly evolve, and it will be excellent for fishing, because the fuel used in ships accounts for the greatest percentage in terms of the carbon footprint. We have some comments from António José Cardoso when it comes to small-scale fishing, industrial fishing, and I talked about that. The fact that is small-scale fishing does not necessarily mean that the carbon footprint is lower. It's on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the fishing gear, on the stocks. When we analyze certain types of fishing gear, and what they are called rapas in the north region, and they had a higher impact. And when it comes to seine fishing, it's well, it depends on the scale of it and the part of the plastic that is lost in certain types of fishing gear, that's a serious problem because there is no way of removing that plastic and has a lot of consequence in terms of maritime ecosystems. And we're conducting that study in terms of octopus, and there's a serious problem with the use of traps, but we don't have yet all of the information in terms of life cycle assessment. We only analyze the plastic that is used in terms of packaging, not the plastic that is left in the ecosystem as a result of the fishing gear employed. We don't have yet all the aspects that are needed to characterize that as an environmental impact category when it comes to the plastic release during fishing. Some things will be improved as we go along, because of course that the types of fishing gear are important, what is left behind in the ecosystem. Now let's hear from Victor from Logrado. I would like to know how you address this topic in your company. How do you see your company and your contribution to climate change and your carbon footprint?
É prazer estar aqui. A sustentabilidade, de facto, é uma preocupação presente no dia a dia de todas as empresas de pesca, especialmente porque o futuro depende dessa sustentabilidade.
The future depends on sustainability, and everything starts in fishing. All the countries where the cod fish is caught, Iceland and Norway and Canada, have quotas, and these are attributed by scientific bodies, and they are eventually being accepted by the national governments. Whenever there is some information, opposing information, the decisions are immediate and with significant reductions. In terms of utilization, codship is a fish that nothing is wasted. For instance, the utilization for human food, all the skin, the scales, the bones, and all the parts, the head, the tongue, even the sperm of cod is used. So the cod is known as the pork from the sea, where the different parts are used for a human food, and those which are sent for fish meal are very small. In the West is practically zero. There are different ways of fishing. The trawling, as you said, the carbon footprint is going to be different depending on the different fishing gears. But Lograd prefers, and is one of the fishing gears that our suppliers really use mostly, the gill net. So particularly in Norway, catches between April and May with very small, with substantial captures in this period, because it's the time when the fish comes closer to the coast and enables to use these opportunities. So the Iceland and Norway have very good examples of these drift nets. Iceland has published a study of the carbon footprint in comparison with other types of proteins, and the Icelandic codfish has obtained 1.9 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product, and the Swedish pork had 3.9. So we're talking about 4 times more between the pork and cod. We're talking about fresh cod in Iceland, and we're not talking about or including processing of cod and transportation. The Swedish broiler had 3.4, the Norway salmon from Norway at 2.6. So the fresh cod was very well positioned. In relation to Lograd, our company's policy includes several criteria. We have commitments with the ethical commitments and the social corporate responsibility, and other of our requirements or criteria is the qualification of human resources, the best manufacturing practices, so as to guarantee sustainable development. This is quite explicit in our company's policy. We are been operating for 35 years, and we're proud to have an award, electric energy and environment, received in 2017 regarding a new production facility, which was a recognition of the fine work in energy field. E-Redes, which was at the time EDP, he wanted to publicize the best practices in good environmental practices in the industry, awarded us with this award. And energy efficiency is a great concern of us at Logrado, not just for economic reasons, but also for environmental reasons. Since 2017, we've been strongly investing in solar panels so as to get our energy for our own consumption via solar panels. We have now started to replace the fossil fuel vehicles into the electric vehicles, and we've always been optimizing our cold storage with the installation of new equipment and in more and more energy efficient equipment. Very much concerned with greenhouse gases. One of our production units uses a primary gas, but the oldest production units still has fluoride. These two production units have on their roof photovoltaic panels. We have an annual reduction of around 700 tons per year of CO2 emissions. Currently, we have around 25% of self-consumption, so we're able to supply 75% of our energy needs. And between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., there are self-consumptions around 80 to 90%. So we're very much dependent upon the sun. Overnight consumptions continue, and we do not have this possibility, but we have been doing our best. We foresee an increase of our area of PV panels, so we're going to have a new car park because specifically we want to increase the area for photovoltaic panels. We are building a new production unit, a third one, where we are going to place photovoltaic panels on our daily life. We have a couple of measures we've been implementing, following suggestions of our staff or the brainstorming within the company or suggestions from external sources. We have created a rule. The salesmen stay at the company's facility for one day per week. It reduces 12,000 kilometers traveled per year. We are currently replacing compound plastic. We used to use this compound plastic in our packages, but now we're going to use monomaterial. So we're able to achieve 100% recycling of packaging. We must invest in some machinery so that it will be possible to use this plastic. We eliminated plastic in our cardboard boxes. Formerly, we covered these boxes with plastic. Now we found another solution to prevent plastic consumption. In these circumstances, we use a different styrofoam for the pallets. So some measures that we have taken, although never being sufficient, we're always on the way to improvement and always having in mind the goal that the carbon footprint will be the best as we can. Thank you very much, Victor. It's really very interesting to understand the different possibilities. Your strategy, and besides energy, also focusing on packaging, everything you can improve, and which you are in fact doing it. You're doing our best, you're thoroughly committed in this area. I have a question from Guinevere. She puts a question in relation to raw materials. If the catches, have you having concerns in terms of this fishing? So if the codfish, so the time they are captured are after the spawning of the codfish, how do you deal with your suppliers in this regard? So the idea that we catch cod before the spawning, it's for economic reasons, basically. When the fish, when they have spawns, they have a higher value. But there are places where it is completely, namely in Iceland, completely forbidden to fish for during 2 weeks. You cannot catch in the spawning region. There is a period when everybody can fish, that can catch there, but there are some protected areas. And this has been working because the information we received from Iceland, which one of the countries that we follow quite closely, that there have always been more and more fish, and it's very easy to fish. Boat vessels are 1 mile away from the coast, and they have their nets full. So there is this concern, and we must have this concern, because otherwise, the future is over. If we think that will depend on codfish, and if we want to catch it all, well, this is not the right approach, and fishermen know this, of course. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes some think, like Sonia said, that the fishermen want to bring all the fish they can on board, but we work with some small fishing companies that when the production unit that sorts the fish orders the fishing vessels to catch fish, it gives them the information, the number of nets they can fill in, so they're not free to catch whatever they want. So so each vessel can fill in 3 nets, and you cannot catch more because we have no capacity to process more. In other countries, such as Norway, this is not the case. In Norway, those controls, the production unit, do not control the fishing vessels. They're very different instances. Each country has its own rules. I agree with Iceland. The production unit orders the fishing vessel to catch more or less depending on their needs, rather than Norway, where you can have 20 fishing vessels full with fish, and the production units don't have the ability to process fish. So they are waiting 3 or 4 days until they can process all the fish. So this is why we've been working more closely with Iceland, for this very reason, because the process is always before rigor mortis. And in Norway, this is never the case, because there's no close link between the production and the fishing, and it raises some problems. Quota management is done at national level, and in my view, it's been a good management. Norway has cut its quota, or this year Norway reduced the quota in 20%. It's a very hard measure, but when that's the case, because there are signs, indications that this should be done, and last year there was an increase of 20%. So these decisions are made based on the fishing stocks and based on mortality and other rules. Maybe the right or wrong measures. Sometimes the vessels carrying out inspections, they may make different assessments. This is to find upon a specific area. The captures are always done the same way, and based on the existing fishing stocks. Fishing at the time of spawning has to do with how easy it is, because the fish is quite close. For the rest of the year, there is fishing gear that cannot be used because the fish is not close by. It goes up north to the deep seas, and it's very fast from capture. And so in that case, only the long line vessels or the trawling vessels have the ability to catch a fish different times of the year. Thank you very much, Victor. Now, let me ask Sonia again to, well, I'd like to use, I have a question by Maria Guedes on implementation of educational skills on this topic in vocational schools for fishermen or for the fishing industry. I quite honestly do not know. I'd really like to know that it is the Formar, the school for fishermen. Do they discuss these topics? Do they have detailed information about this? Do you know anything about this, Sonia? And I'd like to ask you if you can, David Pilon has written a message, and he talked about the project Participesca. He tells us that fishermen are fully aware that too many fishing gear is a problem. The fact that there is a surplus makes some of the fishing gear being lost, and fishermen are aware of this because they live on the coast and they see the fishing gear on the beach. And there was a demonstration of recovery of these lost fishing gear. Can you tell us a bit about these two questions? In relation to Formar, yes, they have shown some willingness to talk about sustainability, improvement of resources in the training provided, not directly in the basic training course for fishermen that allows fishermen to attain license, but they provide training in relation to improvement of quality, handling seafood. You can't imagine how sometimes seafood is dealt with on board, because, and I'm glad that people don't know how things that happen. There's been this concern from our side. In my view, this should be included in the basic curricula for fishermen's training. I mean, this should not be an optional training. It should be part of the basic training for fishermen. But we are on the right way, on the right direction. There is an improvement and increasing awareness on the fishermen's side of the carbon footprint, too much consumption of fuels. In relation to the question by David to the surplus of the fishing gear, this is one of the biggest problems of the octopus fishing vessels, a very serious problem. There's no way of inspecting and controlling this. We've thought about this often. There are fishermen who are fully aware of this problem and they know what it entails. But unfortunately, we have many fishermen who are not fully aware of this problem. And they just think, okay, let us bring all the seafood that we can catch on board. We have been working with them so that they understand that if they bring 500 kilograms of seafood instead of 100 kilograms, we can value the seafood differently. They are going to earn the same. But it's not easy for them to make them understand. It's not easy for them to realize and to accept this, and that there's a high level of competition. There's still a long way to go. We still have lots to do to convince them, and DocaPet has been quite helpful in this regard. Just we're trying to explain fishermen that in fact bringing everything on board it may cause an impact into the market prices. They have to realize it's not the quantity but the quality of the product that matters. In relation to the project that David was mentioning, the so-called dispositivos, devices. I was there in the presentation at university. It's a very interesting device. The one which was presented it cannot be used for our fishing gear yet, but they have another project which can be used for our fishing gear. Fission, when I talked to them about this, they were quite interested because they lose fishing gear every day. Some are recovered, others are not. So this is an investment which is being lost besides all the pollution in the sea, which is not recovered. So besides the environmental issue, there's economic issue because the fishing gear is expensive. You know, for them, they're not so worried about the environmental issue. Well, they're not so concerned with the environmental impact, but they are worried with the economic impact. So if they are worried about recovering the fishing gear and not losing them, we're really helping the environment. But let's not exaggerate on the protection of the environment which they reject. Sometimes when you say, let's try to recover fishing gear, it's good for you and it's good for the environment, for both. Fine, thank you very much, Sonia. Now, going back to Fabio and aquaculture, let's think about the future. You have told us about certification. Some producers think about certification. In your view, what could be done? What is lacking? What would really be most important for aquaculture in Portugal so that we should improve your carbon footprint performance so that you can commit with this political requirement of carbon neutrality? We talked about labeling, carbon tax, which is being discussed. You know, could this be improved? Does it bring any benefits for your products? Working with NGOs on the field will be helpful, or even working with researchers. In your opinion, what is yet to be done? Where could you give a greater contribution? What is your idea about the future? On our side, as I told you, it's very important. And the main thing is the market studies. Beside the market studies that our members to know whether the consumer is prepared to pay a bit more for more sustainable fish. It's important to work together with the research institute, with the academia, to know whether the consumer is really willing and prepared to pay an extra price, so that we could work on sustainability and carbon footprint. And also the support provided by the state through the FEAPA. It's very important, the subsidy for digital transition for the increase of energy efficiency. In aquaculture, we use vessels use diesel, so it's very important that the support being provided for engine replacement. Sometimes the government forgets that aquaculture also uses vessels to catch products, and we need the transition into a better energy efficiency. And a very important point, this is more relevant for aquaculture. We all in aquaculture are certain that our product at European level is one of the most sustainable, more regulated at international level. We're able to guarantee not just quality, but a much higher sustainability in comparison to other markets. But there is a caveat. We are more sustainable, but we are the most expensive, amongst the most expensive. So there are the competitors in the market which are less regulated. For instance, the Asian markets on Greek and Turkish markets are less regulated. And let me give you an example of a meeting we had yesterday at European level with several representatives of different European countries. And of course, there is a political issue, of course. For instance, Turkey was saying, well, we have a high demand from the Russian market, so we were able to sell all the product to Russia and enable them to produce more and to keep low prices. And we apply sanctions to Russia. For instance, the fish is not exported to Russia, so it has consequence for countries which still export to those countries. This is the case of Russia, but the case of other countries. We really have a much better product, more quality, but the price is a very restrictive factor for the consumer. For the price to go down so that we can be more competitive, we require some support by the government for energy efficiency and particularly to promote our seafood, not just aquaculture, but seafood, Portuguese seafood in general. We, the Portuguese, consume many fish, which enables us to have a smaller environmental impact in relation to the food we consume. But these consumers should not greatly depend on export, but 70% of our seafood consumption wholly depends on exports. We consume a great deal of fish, fine, but we have to consume our own fish caught here and processed here so that we have a better environmental impact. I'm a bit curious, Fabio, following up on the question by Maria Inês Trigo, the advantages that you're telling us about agriculture in Portugal. How do you communicate this? How do you inform others? How do you tell clients and restaurants, for instance, how do you tell this to Nutrifish, Pedro's company, so that they can make the difference between a Portuguese aquaculture and aquaculture from other countries? How is your communication? There are two ways of communicating and not comparing with European markets, but with Asian markets. The fish that arrives here is less regulated. We have European regulations that I have to comply with. There is more food safety regarding our products. And there is something which is crucial: the time the fish takes to arrive here. If we buy a fish from an Asian market, it takes 1, 2, 3 days to arrive here. If we buy a fish which is not as fresh, and what we buy in Portuguese aquaculture is produced by order, but it's in our tanks, but we only fish the quantity according to our orders. If, for instance, if there is an order of 200 kilograms of fish, the aquaculture catches the fish and they are immediately distributed to the client, which guarantees food safety. So this is our big difference from international products, is the freshness and more regulation in our products. Thank you very much. Now let's move into Pedro. After hearing so many improvements and many interesting things in your activity, where you're already implementing some of these measures, what can still be improved? What would be the best way for you of improving carbon footprint and how seafood impacts climate change? And how do you communicate these investments? Does it bring benefits to the market? Does it bring added value to your products? Does this investment have a return?
Eu acho que sim, porque nós estamos nisto por uma questão de integridade, digamos,
It
quase.
is worth it, yes, because it's about also for us moral, ethical integrity. There's only one way of companies surviving in the long run is to having these principles, social responsibility, environmental responsibility. And if we want to preserve our planet, we have to contribute to that as players. We have the issue of political commitment, and sometimes they've made of standards, and now we talk about a carbon neutrality. I'm going to share with you an experience that I had when it came to the freezing project. We want to create a new line of frozen products, frozen seafood in Portugal. Because there are a lot of companies, but they use foreign raw materials. Nothing against that. It's an industry, but depending and according to our clientele and trying to provide a fresh product, we work with Portuguese seafood products. And so we prepared an application that was Portuguese seafood, but it was rejected because we did not have time to include, for example, the solar panels and other measures that meet what are now the political measures. And so we lost against other big companies, like, for example, Cantuna. They use tuna from other locations. So we want to freeze Portuguese seafood as a result of our artisanal fishing bought at local auctions, but the application was not accepted because other companies had solar panels and we did not have it. Well, we did not have time to include it, but maybe they may have solar panels, but they fish or they source in the Maldives. So there is a lot of complexity. It doesn't have solar panels, but the tuna traveled halfway around the world to get here. The raw material is important from a long distance. It can arrive by sea, more sustainable than by air. But this political complexity is complicated, and we cannot forget the economic scales. Do we want to value locally sourced food, local fishing, or do we just want to develop the industry? Sometimes we have to resort also to foreign workers and laborers. So we're talking about sometimes foreign seafood that is imported to Portugal, processed in Portugal by foreign workers, but they have solar panels, so that's valued. But I think that's wrong in the sense that we source locally. For example, we are in Albufeira and we go and buy from the auctions in Quarteiras, 20 kilometers away, so it's locally sourced. Policies have to open horizons and the applications need to take into account other factors. About the advantage of working with sustainable products, since we have a direct connection to chefs, they know that about the products. The new line of frozen products in cardboard boxes for the end consumer, the labels are important. We have sometimes amazing fish without labels. It's not necessarily the label that it's going to, you just look at the fish and you see that it's fresh. But of course, for some countries, Germany, Switzerland, it's essential to have an eco label identifying the fishing year and also identifying some part of the efforts to be sustainable, the carbon footprint. I think that's the way to go, not just for end consumers, but also for professional consumers when it comes to restaurant chefs, although the relationship is much more direct and we don't feel as much need to resort to eco labels. Thank you, Pedro. Just one short comment. I would say that assessment criteria when it comes to application probably depends on the source of financing the different funds. But the issues of sustainability are not clear for anyone. Indicators need to be quantified, and when it comes, for example, to comparing the different types of fishing gear, it's not always obvious, even for people who work with this, and that's the objective of this type of event, to increase debates and insights exchanges. People associate a high carbon footprint to transport. It isn't as relevant sometimes unless it is by plane. But also it's also about energy consumption, but there are other aspects that need to be quantified. And we need a proper methodology, otherwise we don't reach the proper conditions. But I do hope that your application finds under financing opportunities. We moved ahead even without the funding. And so we would have an additional incentive if we had that funding, but we still believe in the project, so we went ahead. Just to say something, Sonia talked about ambiguity. For example, in Algarve, our fishing is very specific. They use less fishing gears when compared to the North region. And usually I joke that Algarve fishermen like to sleep at home. And so they go, they fish that species, and they come home. Here in the North region, they leave the nets 2-3 days at sea, and they remain at sea for that time. And we feel that the ships tend to bring more fish resulting from different types of fishing gear. But if we think about the carbon footprint, if maybe it's better, because if a ship goes to sea, you are really making the most out of that fuel, because you're staying at sea longer, fishing more. I think that it's more balanced in terms of energy consumption. Is what isn't as good maybe for the maritime ecosystems. We cannot check all of the boxes, social, ecological. Yes, we need different indicators. This aspect that I also addressed when it comes to stock management, it is not included directly in the carbon footprint. If we don't have a stock, even if the carbon footprint seems low, and sometimes it is reflected on the carbon footprint in the sense that the fishermen have to travel further when it comes to cod fish from the Baltic Sea. Those issues of stock are not reflected on carbon footprint, but if the stock is not managed, and some are not, and some that are managed are not complying with the recommended levels, of course, that then we cannot ensure sustainability, because a part of that sustainability is then not reflected on the carbon footprint, and there's serious consequences for the ecosystems and also for the economic activities depending on them. Now I'd move to Vitor to know a bit more. After hearing about the effort that Olgrad has been doing in terms of the raw materials, the packaging, how do you see the future? Do you think that effort pays off? Do you have a return on that investment? But how also do you communicate that? I think that your company also has a lot of international customers. So Do you feel that your customers are worried about that and ask for eco labels or reports? How does that work for cod? Sheila, if you allow me, I will have to defend myself. I love Portuguese fish, sardines, mackerel, octopus, but cod is probably one of the most Portuguese types of fish that we have. They started drying it and salting it. We still have a very strong industry, although we also get some cod fish from abroad, but we also defend the added value by receiving the raw material and then processing it ourselves, and it comes by sea. And so the footprint is reduced a bit in that sense. Pedro is a friend. We have sailed together, but I had to defend my fish, so to say. Regarding our investments, we do believe they will pay off at all levels in the medium and long term. This week, we published in the social media an image of one of the new packages of cod fish, 100% recyclable. And we do hope people are more and more on the lookout regarding this, but maybe not so much in Portugal. There are other markets where there is more awareness regarding these issues. Regarding our company, we have a certification, MSC, our certification for cod. Not all cod has that certification. We are certified. But then there needs to be traceability in terms of the product. This means that some of our product has the certification, other products don't. And some international customers do have that demand, and in Portugal, just a few. We don't see a lot of concern regarding that in Portugal just yet, but we do believe in our company that we need to all move towards that. Otherwise, we could not have improvements. And as Pedro was saying, and it's a pity that Pedro did not get the financing, the company did not get the financing, but sometimes you have very tight rules and criteria. But our obligation is to invest in that area so that we have more and more sustainable products with more sustainable packaging that is recyclable, and to try to decrease our footprint as much as possible. And we are open to suggestions to improve our carbon footprint. Thank you, Vitor. The carbon footprint of cod, and I showed that when it comes to other products, is relatively low. Of course, that also depends on the fishing gear. Of course, it's always relative. It depends on a person's specific diet, but cod has a better carbon footprint when compared to other species. And when it comes, for example, to traditional processing, it has a lower energy consumption in cost, and that's also interesting. And that's why we have more and more cod. In Neptune, we have been studying that. And consumers, knowing that may choose precisely cod, knowing that it may lead to a better footprint on their part. If you allow me, I'd just like to add nothing against Lograd, of course. As Victor says, we are friends. I was trying to focus on fundamentalism in terms of the policies. I always eat logrado codfish at Christmas. It is deeply Portuguese, but it is unfair not to value projects that focused on locally sourced raw materials. But of course, that projects like Lograd makes sense, a very well managed company with sustainable policies, as Victor has described. But I was focusing more on political fundamentalism. I think some flexibility is needed. And just as Victor said, and it happens sometimes with cod that they're fished at a time when they're reproducing. But of course, that we usually fish the seafood when they're closer to the coast, and that's quite often matches the time when reproducing. But we have more and more species with restrictions, sometimes something like 15 or 20 monkfish and other. And so if we want to continue to have fish, we need to let them reproduce, of course. For example, in Algarve, as a result of the pandemic, there's an interruption in fishing. And now we see that there's a lot more shrimp being fished because they had the time to reproduce. It was forced, but they had time to really recover in terms of the stocks. Thank you, Pedro. I have two questions from Francisco Leitão. He asks if Lograda, if, for example, they lack the raw material codfish, if there is a shortage, have you thought of a raw material that would come from the Portuguese coast as an alternative? Have you ever thought about this? No, not yet. We have very specific units for cod. But a packaging room that freezes cod or the soaks cod can do other things. It has never been on the table because we still have huge amounts of cod. It's more now about the size of the companies. We have less and less small companies, and we have major groups controlling the fishing quotas. We have a lot of concentration. In Norway, we see that the Norwegian companies that dominated salmon now also dominate cod. We have quotas, we have sufficient cod, but this year we felt that there was a lot of demand when it comes to cod, but also other types of seafood. It reached record levels. If consumers are going to continue to consume, that's our main concern. If the Portuguese are going to continue to have money to buy cod because the prices are increasing, that's our major concern. But we do believe that the markets will adjust. Our competition is, or our risk is not so much about the absence of raw material, but fresh, for example, the fish chips in the UK. a whole fresh fish, a kilo of cod fish landing will be 300 grams when dried and salted. And of course, that has an effect in terms of price. Sometimes people don't think about that. It's dried, it's salted, no head. And then when they go and buy cod, they find it difficult sometimes to balance that or analyze that when they compare, for example, to chicken. That is our major concern, the concentration that we have in terms of quota owners and the increase in prices that might mean that the Portuguese won't be able to buy cod in the near future. But we are prepared for other species. We have tested in our new units because as a result of requests of some chefs, for example, with carp, we have dried and salted. We have done it, but it's about the scale and the market. We also have fish that is not consumed in Portugal, like, for example, saithe. It's darker, but it's similar to mackerel. It's very tasty, but it's about a darker color, and the consumers want white fish generally. That's interesting because cod has huge advantages, even in terms of fishing. It's a special species. That's why it's so processed, and it's almost a commodity. Because there are lots of markets all over the world that consume cod. There are several processing plants. It's a very complex market. But it's a very interesting species in terms of its capture, processing. I thought it was interesting comparing with chicken, that you compared it with chicken. Because when I was working in sardine, a fisherman was saying that he didn't want sardines to be much more expensive than chickens. That would be a source of food for those who consume sardines, especially in the summer. You saw that chicken at a very similar price. But the problem is not that the sardine has a high price, because that will probably happen because of stock issues or because fuel is more expensive. At the time you had the sardine certification, the problem is that the price of chicken was so low. So consumers also need to be educated regarding that, because if we buy a product that supposedly has to meet so many requirements but has such a low price, maybe some things are not being considered, and the type of life that the animal had cannot be compared with the life of a sardine, a wild sardine. Sustainability is always relative in terms of what we compare. We can do it for better or for worse. It's interesting to try and understand the average and how we compare different diets and how we as human beings can contribute to the preservation of these ecosystems. I maybe would ask one last question for Sonia. There was a question shared on the chat when it comes to migration and concentration of some of the species, and maybe capture increase at that time. It's not always that simple. For example, regarding octopus, it's very complex to to try and understand when you should have that period of protection is very diverse. One thing is to produce poultry, other types of livestock. But when we're talking about seafood, we have a lot of species, different needs in the trophic chain. What can you say about the octopus, such an important species in Portugal from the economic standpoint? As you were saying, on land in aquaculture is very easy to control the factors that lead to the reproduction of a species. At sea is not that easy. There are times that we need that protection because that closure period, because the species needs to recover. And the octopus is a very complex species. We have two peaks identified where we see the youngsters, but we cannot exactly determine that next year or this year in October or November, the octopus will reproduce. It has to do with food availability, water temperature. And so everything influences. And so we talk about that closed season for octopus, and fishermen are in favor of that. But the problem is defining when that period will. No, it's in October. No, it's in September, maybe in May. It would be excellent to have indeed that closed season. When we talk about a closed season, it's about protecting youngsters, the offspring, but we run into a wall when it comes to deciding when we should have that closure period. It is rejected by the scientific community because it is said that the species, the octopus is a rapid growth period, but it's about basically letting the octopus be for a while for that closed season. We also have a product that we sell that is a result of our traditional artisanal fishing. Fresh fish, not with the dimension da Nutrifresco, as we work locally with local populations. And something that shocked us, so to say, we worked in Olhão, Tavira, in Faro. These are fishing communities, but most people do not consume national seafood products. We sell our products, but they say, oh, you don't have that fish. Oh, that's not Portuguese. There's a strong lack of awareness on part of consumers. Lack of awareness when it comes to fishing gear, when it comes to the species. The octopus of Algarve is considered one of the best octopus in the world. 80%, if not 90% of the octopuses fished in Portugal is exported. Because the octopus that is sold here and consumed here in Portugal, it is in Portuguese. For example, in Italy, we export a lot to Italy, and it is expensive there. And it's very appreciated because it's very high quality and it gets there still fresh. And I think that the Portuguese haven't been as worried about that. It also has to do with purchasing power. Of course, it is an expensive product. Pedro deals more with chefs, but maybe he also has this notion that in Portugal, that we feel that we are not appreciated in terms of what we have, with some of the best fish sold in the world. Excellent products, absolutely excellent products. Thank you, Sonia. It's very interesting to hear that. We hear that we import a lot of seafood, but we also export. And so when we talk about seafood consumption, we sometimes find it difficult to understand where it comes from. It's about this economic balance, but it's very interesting. So Portuguese fish is valued, Portuguese seafood is valued, but some markets have more purchasing power to buy it. It does bring added value, but then here in Portugal, we end up not having enough fish to feed ourselves. And then this leads to other considerations. I know that Fabio wanted to say something. I don't know if Pedro also wants to say something. Just a few remarks. The older generation of chefs would import luxury products because what was good, what was essential for a good dish was a good product. And 20, 30 years ago, major chefs used imported products, but now I see that the new generation of chefs, they're exceptional. They want more and more Portuguese products, Portuguese seafood, ultra fresh, locally sourced. It has to do, for example, also, for example, with the cheese. We see the same thing, cheese from Serra da Estrela, and you was talk about sardine here from Algarve and other species from other areas here in Portugal. Regarding private individuals, I think people lack some awareness in terms of, for example, being able to distinguish fresh fish, wild fresh fish from aquaculture. I ate sea bass last week, but it tasted like whale. It was from aquaculture. Not to criticize, but well, when it's wild, when it's fresh, it is better. We have salmon from Norway and fish from Turkey and Greece. And sometimes consumers prefer fattened fish from aquaculture. Then, may it be sea bream or sea bass, other than eating fresh mackerel from our coast. And it would have a much lower carbon footprint. It would just travel in Portugal, not the entire Europe, but we still lack that environmental awareness. People do not identify in the supermarket the difference from buying, for example, a fish from Greece or from Portugal. And if you compare wild with aquaculture, they look at the label of salmon, sea bass, sea bream. We do not export, for example, mackerel, but that does not mean that it's not good. But mackerel's at the level of sardine, and people like eating sardines, but not so much mackerel, but it's excellent fish. And when we compare the fish, it can be much tastier when compared to much more expensive fish. We are about to participate in a project with schools. They're going to foster the consumption of locally sourced fish. And when little, we're faced with sometimes frozen fish of poor quality. And we also find out about the bones of the fish. And quite often, public canteens focus on price and not quality. And we have an ongoing project focused on providing canteens, school canteens with locally sourced fish. It makes much more sense, I believe, than sourcing elsewhere. It's about our economic balance, but also in terms of gastronomy. If we can eat fresh mackerel, why are we going to eat frozen fish from the Maldives? We have the quality of the fresh fish, also the quality of the canned foods, and the cod fish that is processed here. But there are many things available, imported aquaculture, and this is also a result of the strong marketing. If you go to worldwide fairs, we have the major participants are from Norway, from Greece, and from Turkey. The marketing that they have is very strong, and it strongly reaches consumers. Salmon and cod fish, and it's great fish. It's big fish. It gets to the consumers already processed. Our mackerel only lasts 2 or 3 days. Salmon lasts much longer, but we should really promote locally sourced products, and we have tried to do that, but we believe we can still do better to convince local populations to consume locally.
Eu acho que é sempre difícil.
Thanks, Pedro. It's always difficult, this paradigm we used to have some years ago, the difference between fishing and aquaculture is no longer there. Aquaculture has been growing a great deal in the last couple of years. There's a huge potential for production of animal protein. It uses tridimensional space, organisms which do not require so much energy-wise. They are cold-blooded organisms, so very efficient in transforming the feed into muscle. When we eat fish come from aquaculture or fishing or a vegetable protein. Well, we have to analyze different species and different benefits. So we are a bit late, Fabio. So what Pedro is telling us about the quality of fish in aquaculture in Portugal, how do you communicate this quality? Is it possible for the consumer? The product is more expensive. This is a big difference. Do you try to promote your product bearing on the animal well-being or environmental benefits? How do you communicate this quality? You talked about Aquaculture Stewardship Council certification. Are there certified products and companies in Portugal? The only product, aquaculture product certified by the YSC is the mussel of the coast of the Algarve. It's the only culture which is certified, all the others are not. But this is what we're trying to attain, and this is what we're trying to do with the European Federation of Aquaculture. But this is a process, as Pedro said, it's very difficult. we have many stronger and bigger markets, and in the international fairs, they are much more efficient than we are. A striking example is salmon. 20, 30 years ago, nobody was consuming salmon in Portugal, and now it's the fish that we consume more nationally. So it was a very strong marketing effort. We try to do it at national level, but as been mentioned quite often, before there is a lack of information, lack of awareness on the consumer side. So, and this awareness has to be done. We have limited resources. These campaigns require huge financing. It's very difficult to get funding for these sort of campaigns for several reasons. One of them is the taxes which the membership taxes which are not paid. There are different types of finance for these campaigns. We have a campaign which is created, which is ready to be launched tomorrow. It's completely concluded, but it's very difficult to find financing for the campaign to be launched. Lastly, let me finish with a very simple example. And putting together the lack of awareness regarding aquaculture and the Portuguese products, I love giving this example. So what happened with one of our members? He goes to a supermarket, he finds a friend. This is not a joke. This is, in fact, something which happens every day. He goes to the supermarket, there's a friend before the fishmongers, you know, why don't you take this sea bream from aquaculture? No, I never eat aquaculture products, and because I don't trust the products. And then this person picks up the salmon fillets and takes them home. So the aquaculture product, which has traveled miles, he's chosen, and he doesn't know it's an aquaculture. There's a terrible lack of information on the side of the consumers. And it's also true. The difference between the national and international aquaculture, we have in small type saying the origin. We don't know how many times the product is in the fishmongers. And there's a difference of the Portuguese product with a higher price, but which is much fresher. Thank you very much, Fabio. We really have to finish our event. Thank you so much, everybody. It was so interesting. We would certainly spend a couple more hours discussing these topics because so many things to learn from one another. And we was very curious to find out how each sector, how each company, how each association deals with these topics. We're certainly going to have future events and the Neptunos project. You'll get the information. Soon we'll have two further events, face-to-face events, and I hope that we will have more projects and more suggestions from the company side. Antonio, some final words, concluding words. I was really delighted with this discussion, which was so enriching. Let me just say a couple of words before closing this session. Firstly, and going back to Pedro and Sonia, and regarding labeling the Neptunos projects, well, there are different approaches regarding labeling. This is just another one, but it's a labeling which is very useful, which covers not just the environmental approach, but also the nutritional component. This is one of the way forward, using labeling and marketing campaigns which make not just consumers, but also the distributors, the great distributors, to promote products, national products, and not just national products, but also products produced in a sustainable way, under the circular economy and in an environmental friendly way. This is one of the way forwards. Of course, that we're always going to have the sea bream from Greece, which will be cheaper, and the sea bream from Turkey, which is going to be cheaper. They produce much more. There are higher temperatures, nothing to be done about it. But they are submitted to the same regulation. They may apply it differently. This is why Portugal is not so good at it. From the Prime Minister Pascoal, we're always beyond what we have. So we make things more complicated instead of making things simpler. So this is what happens regarding seafood. So this is a discussion we should have. We have to cut bureaucracy and cut the implementation of regulation in seafood. Lastly, in relation to Pedro, in relation to the fishing quotas and the closed areas, to define the closed area, you really have to know the species in different areas, in the different regions. It takes many years, implies a huge involvement, and it's IPMA who's in charge of doing it, and we have some European obligations regarding the fishing quotas. To introduce new species is very important, but then we don't have resources to do it. The government does not provide us with the necessary resources to do it. So, you know, we have minimum sizes, don't forget, minimum sizes help out to level out these strike the balance between guaranteeing the reproduction of the species and the species maintenance across time. And the closed area is more difficult to implement precisely because what Sonia mentioned, the huge variety we have, warm coast down south, very cold coast up north, so the reproduction is very different across the year. And you have to monitor it all, which is really difficult. Now, some closing remarks. First of all, I'd really like to thank all the speakers. I've thanked these speakers in the first session. I thank you all who were available and who passed on your know-how and shared it with us and with the public. All that you know and your opinions. It's very important to have this synergy between society at large, companies, consumers, and research. Really like to thank you the time you spent with us, to thank the public for having participated and attended. I'd also like to remind you that IPMA and Neptunus project are going to organize 2 further events, on face-to-face events on the 6th of June in Olhão. You're all invited to attend on the IPMA's facilities at Olhão. And the second one will be held in Lisbon on the 21st September at IPMA facilities, when we're not just going to discuss these components or these approaches, we're going to discuss what the project will deliver, the outcomes of the project, and listen to the different viewpoints. We didn't hear solutions regarding processing and distribution, which is very important to innovate. Lastly, a message. Let me remind you that seafood is healthy and safe, and its environmental footprint, although it varies, it's very low compared with other food. This is extremely important. Let's take this on board and let's inform others about this fact. And we should call the attention of both producers, distributors, and the processing companies and retailers. They're not just concerned with selling the product. No, they work every day to guarantee that the products they sell come from sustainable sources and they get to the consumer with the maximum possible quality and safety. And this message has to be passed on. We contribute every day so that there will be as little waste as possible within the circular economy. This is a message that should be passed on to those who listen. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, to listen to your presentation. I'm certain that you will be present in the next events. Thank you so much.